I can understand why an animal would be considered a moral patient and not morally responsible for its actions, but this ignores cases where the animal initiates sexual contact and the human acquiesces to its advances. And in this case, clearly no harm is being done to the animal, nor is the animal being treated disrespectfully. Quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, if the animal asks for sex and the human being presents themselves in such a manner as to say yes to this, what disrespect is there to the animal? Though it's a little harder to ascertain, similar considerations allow one to invalidate this objection, even in cases in which the animal is on the receiving end, so long as the animal is treated respectfully, so long as one pays attention to the signals of its consent or lack thereof, and reacts accordingly. And if one defines respectful treatment to exclude all interspecies sexual contact, I would like to know how one justifies this definition, given the clear sex drives present in some animals as well as their social attachment to human beings, the combination of which would naturally lead to some animals being sexually attracted to human beings. A third argument attempts to establish all interspecies sexual contact as coerced. Quote, and here he's going by the work of a feminist by the name of Adams, who states that all animal interaction is to some degree coercive. Animals' interaction with humans, and I quote, is always infused with the possibility of coercion. So it is with sex. In the same way that sexual assault against women differs from normal sex because the former is sex obtained by physical, economic, psychological, or emotional coercion, any of which implies the impossibility of genuine consent, so too, Adam's assertion that bestiality is always sexual coercion, forced sex, is surely a correct description of most, if not all, human-animal sexual relations. Then Professor Beirne notes that he doesn't think this assertion is necessarily correct, simply because the human and animal have unequal power, as Adams would use to justify this, since this description applies also to virtually all sexual activity between two or more creatures. Remember those kidnapped women from before? Same argument can be used there, essentially. That the potential for such a situation exists in virtually any sexual encounter, and to claim that because the possibility is there, it should be forbidden outright is ludicrous. But then he goes on to assert that animals cannot genuinely consent to sex, and are therefore coerced. To support this, he veers off into phenomenological arguments by Nagel, and oddly enough, I've heard this kind of argument before. The idea is that we can't possibly know how other animals experience the world, and thus cannot ascertain whether they are sent to a particular course of action or not. This, I would have to say, is clearly false, as is evidenced again by simple biology. We, as human beings, observe that both we and other animals have similar mechanisms for both basic biological functions, sexual functioning is a clear example of this, as well as more complex behavioral and psychological phenomena, empathy, social order, emotions, that sort of stuff. Moreover, we observe that animals have these capabilities both within their own species and towards other species, and particularly towards human beings, and dogs are especially astute in this regard. What, other than a fatalistic argument that being at all ignorant is equivalent to being completely oblivious, would allow us to conclude with this information that human beings cannot tell whether animals assent to a behavior or not? And if we can tell whether the animal assents, and use this information to determine whether sexual advances are welcomed, what exactly is morally wrong about that in general? Now, before I go on, I should note that people who ignore such signs and go ahead whether the animal consents or not are obviously committing an immoral act. But I would not paint all sexual interactions with that brush, and in fact I think proper education would have us figure out what the signs of an animal's consent are, and react accordingly so that no actual rape is ever done. I'm not saying that it makes rape impossible, I'm just saying that it makes it much more difficult to justify morally. To belabor the point, Beirne makes another argument that all such activity is coercive. His argument is that animals are effectively unable to refuse sexual advances, either because they're incapable of refusing due to their docile and often human-bred natures, or in cases of apparent refusal, they are incapable of enforcing their will. Well, as anyone who's ever been bitten by a dog or kicked by a mare can attest to, animals are certainly not defenseless. In fact, given the large sizes of animals required to take part in such activity without harming the animal, moral cases of bestiality are really, physically, far riskier to the human being involved than to the animal. See, for an example of this, the unfortunate death of Mr. Hands. Beirne then defines interspecies sexual assault as all sexual advances by humans to animals. Once again, this is very broad, and the author admits as much. However, he then goes on a tangent on how sexist language often uses animals as metaphors to place women as somehow less than human, and therefore exploitable without guilt. This comparison only carries weight as a moral argument, however, if we accept such a rigid hierarchy as valid. In fact, the relationship between human beings and other species is way more complicated than this, in that I would argue that certain animals are, in some ways, superior to humans, and not inferior in all ways as was supposed by Christian philosophy for thousands of years. Having made his arguments that bestiality is immoral, Beirne then goes on to describe various types of bestiality. These include sexual fixation, commodification, adolescent sexual experimentation, and aggravated cruelty. I'll go through each one in turn because they are qualitatively different and deserve different treatments from an ethical standpoint. Sexual fixation is used to be interchangeable with zoophilia in this paper, though I would argue that they're not at all the same thing. Sexual fixation is exclusive physical attraction to non-human animals, while zoophilia is an emotional or psychological attraction to non-human animals. There may be some overlap there, but they're certainly not identical. Beirne dismisses this as both rare and a poor justification. He then goes out of his way to paint all zoophiles as zoosadists, people who hurt animals for sexual pleasure, by speculating on their motives. And this quote is awful. It is just as likely that fixated humans assault animals not because they believe it benefits their sexual partners, but because they enjoy inflicting pain on other creatures, who in this particular case just happen to be animals because animals are more available to them than humans. Do they often not start with animals and eventually graduate to humans? Ugh. Anyone who has given even a cursory glance to the research on zoophiles shows that, in their eyes, this is not the case. Obviously, this needs to be studied further to confirm or disprove the assertion that the animals benefit as well, but such baseless accusations only serve to show that the author has in mind a stereotypical worst case of zoophilia already, and he seeks to argue against this rather than the phenomenon as it's generally practiced. Moving on, commodification is the type of bestiality practiced in pornography and other profit-focused sexual practices. The use of animals here is the same ethically as the use of animals in a circus or in a television show. Abuse is possible, but also preventable with proper precautions, though admittedly, greater precautions should be taken to prevent actual sexual abuse for profit. One might argue that these uses of animals are also wrong, but the same arguments would need to be made for both non-sexual and sexual cases of using animals for the gratification of human beings. Personally, I think that so long as the animal is treated with care and respect, there is nothing inherently wrong with training the animal to perform for entertainment purposes or otherwise. Now, the third type is adolescent sexual experimentation, and this is probably the most common form of bestiality, and is in the largest moral gray area. Again, there is nothing inherently wrong with this, but care must be taken to ensure that adolescents do not abuse animals in their care solely to satisfy their own lusts. Better structured sexual education and more encouragement of responsible sex would likely prevent most of this. I would add that probably most sexual experiences with animals occur once or a few times in a person's life and are basically there as sexual outlets for adolescents. This is not zoophilia in its truest sense, but it is something which needs to be addressed as a part of the idea of bestiality. Finally, there is aggravated cruelty, clearly the most heinous of the four, and there may be other types, but these are all that Professor Beirne describes, and also, thankfully, the rarest. Unfortunately, this is the form of bestiality which leaves behind the most evidence, and is thus perceived to be more common than it actually is. Such acts could obviously be covered by any animal cruelty statute, as in such cases there is clear physical and or psychological harm to the animal, which could be detected by any third party, and especially by a veterinary exam. The paper concludes by summarizing the previous parts and lamenting the lack of proper study of bestiality. I too lament this lack of study, but for an entirely different reason. I think there exists clear evidence of mutually consensual, beneficial sexual relationships between human beings and other animals. Such relationships are moral in any rational moral system, utilitarian, liberal rights, etc., which does not make them immoral purely by definition. For example, the biblical morality would state that bestiality is completely immoral, but there's no explanation for why, and thus I would dismiss this. I'll be happy to defend this position if asked about it, but for now I'll just say that more study is needed to determine whether this kind of human-animal interaction should be discouraged in all cases, and I welcome such study even if it completely disproves my opinion, for at least then I'll know whether I'm wasting my time defending it. So that's it for this video. If you have comments about the arguments presented here, why you think they're right or wrong, whether you think that there are better arguments for bestiality's impermissibility, or whether I've somehow misrepresented Professor Beirne. I don't think I have, but I'm willing to make corrections if that is the case. So, anyone who wants to, just leave a comment below the video, and if it's substantive on the arguments, I'll respond to it, either in comment form or in video. So that's it for now.